Okay, simple summary for this week. I'm doing this instead of Tapestry in week 7. The point value is the same. You'll do less research, so I guess on some level you guys should be happy that I've switched it up. But the reason that I've switched it up is that I think talking about the 1960s and talking about the civil rights and talking about the domestic policy of the United States needs a little more than, research this one obscure person. Instead, I'm going to talk about someone who's not obscure. Although I recognize that a lot of you are young enough that these names might be unfamiliar. I'm talking about Lyndon Johnson, who was the 36th president of the United States, native-born Texan, a person that I can't possibly talk about in 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 minutes and unravel him because he's a very complicated figure. So there's not enough time for a full biography, but basically, the son of a politician, but a politician who lost his small fortune or whatever prosperity he had, and the father became a failure, and Johnson was deeply affected by this. He went from being a little boy who idolized his father so much that he would dress like him and follow him around to being someone who was ashamed of his father, and it motivated him to be more successful politically, economically, and in life. The land on which you can go to this day, you can go to the LBJ Ranch in Texas, and you can go see to the Western White House, and you can tour the ranch. It's still a working ranch. That land has been in the Johnson family for a long time, but Johnson's father lost it because he wasn't, frankly, a very good rancher. And Johnson himself became so successful and powerful that he was able to buy that land back and used modern technology to bridge the Pedernales River that had wiped out his father's crops over and over again. And it's kind of like, I'm going to succeed where my father failed. And so he overcame that, but he was not a wealthy kid. His parents had to scrape by because of all the financial difficulties that they had with the ranch. And it affected his young life. When he was in Johnson City as a boy, he would walk down the street and people would mutter, there's that no good Johnson boy, And his father couldn't get credit in the stores anymore. And the girl that he liked, he had to walk down the sidewalk and watch her drive down the road with the boy that had a car, whose parents and the girl's parents were okay with that boy, but not with Lyndon. And those things have effects on people even decades later. So Johnson, it kind of lit a fire in him as a boy, and that fire fueled him. Now, it's not all good. I'm not saying it's a happy ending, but he did go on to graduate from college and go into politics and become very successful in Washington very quickly. He wasn't even 30 when he was in Congress. And when you're a member of Congress, you're one of 435 people. You're not really that important, but he gravitated to certain people and he understood power and he knew how to get it. And so he became a powerful congressman. And then a decade later, a powerful senator. And then he became the youngest majority leader of the Senate. And the Senate is an institution that defies control, but Johnson found a way. A famous biography about him is called Master of the Senate. And he could make it do things that it had not done before. And this kind of legislative ability made him a leading candidate for president. But that's not the same thing, right? Being a great senator doesn't make you a great president. Different branches, different skills. And he didn't have the appeal that some other candidates did nationally. And he wasn't a great speaker, at least on TV. He could be great in person. On TV, he was really stiff and reserved and a little self-conscious and not great. And so in 1960, when he ran for president, he did not get the nomination. Kennedy did. And Johnson accepted the vice presidency, which a lot of people thought was a mistake. Like, you're giving up all your power in the Senate to go into this useless job. And he hated it. So Johnson was vice president for 2 years, 10 months, and 2 days. And it was the longest time of his life because he didn't get to do anything. And then Kennedy was assassinated, and Johnson suddenly, miraculously, is president. And as you'll see in the written lecture, there's some discussion about what he's going to do with that. And people advised him about the politics of pursuing things like civil rights. And he said, in response, when he was counseled not to do that, he said, well, what the hell's the presidency for then? And he took that persuasive power that he had, where he would sweet talk you or promise you something or convince you by logic, or stand, he's a big guy, stand on top of you and, get too close and invade your personal space and poke you and prod you and pull on your lapels, or he'd threaten you. He was going to get what he wanted. If President Kennedy called a senator and said, I'm not going to do the voice, or the accent, but I'd really like your help on this vote, the guy would say, well, I'm sorry, Mr. President, if I do that, I'm going to be in trouble here at home and blah, blah, blah. And Kennedy would say, well, all right, I appreciate that. And Johnson would not accept those things. He called these people, and he wouldn't let them off the phone until they agreed. And again, persuasion, promises, sweet talk, flattery. I'll be a big brother to you. I'll be a son to you, or I'll threaten you, whatever. I'm going to get what I want. And he did. And it's his sheer force of will that took the civil rights bills that really changed the lives of people of color in this country and turned them from impossible to the law. Prior to this, if you were a person of color, you just didn't have the same rights, especially in the South, particularly in the South. There were separate restrooms, there were separate dining facilities, there were separate schools. Segregation was still a fact, even though it had been theoretically struck down by the Supreme Court. Let me give you an example. Johnson had household staff who were black, and they would go back and forth from Texas, sometimes they'd be in Texas, sometimes they'd be in Washington. And Johnson's staff one time begged him, said, please don't make me travel that way. And he didn't understand why. Because if this poor woman who worked, this dignified woman who happened to be black, needed a place to stop and use the restroom, she couldn't do it. They would say, well, there's a creek out back. You can go out there. You can go crouch in the weeds. You're just treated inhumanly. And for all of Johnson's flaws, he accomplished the end of those things. He changed. He took that big curtain in front of the voting booth that had essentially blocked people of color from voting in the South, and he's the one that essentially flung that curtain open and put their hands on the levers of the voting booth. He was also a terrible person in some ways. He lied when he didn't even have to. It was Johnson and Nixon in succession who had so much trouble telling the truth that it undermined people's belief in the presidency. And we've, on some level, not really recovered from that. I'm not going to blame Trump or anybody recent for that. That started with Johnson and Nixon. Now, were presidents before that always honest? Of course not. Sometimes you didn't say things because it wasn't good. Sometimes you'd not say things because of national security. Eisenhower lied about certain things that were tied to what we'd acquired from spies and intelligence and that sort of thing. But just constant lying. That's Johnson and that's Nixon. One Democrat, one Republican. This is not a partisan statement on my behalf. He could be unspeakably cruel. He could be very crude to people. But he was also capable of incredible generosity. Again, I can't sum up a person that is a mystery wrapped in an enigma inside a puzzle in 10 minutes. But he was one of the greatest presidents in American history if, and only if, you look at his domestic record. It's not just civil rights. It's Medicare, it's Medicaid, it's aid to education, it's increasing the environment, protection of the environment. This was called the Great Society. That was the name of his legislative program. You know, you have the New Deal, the Square Deal, the Fair Deal, the New Frontier. Sometimes, and it's hard for those names to stick now. People, it doesn't work anymore. But Johnson's was called the Great Society, and he envisioned America as a place that was fairer to everybody, that was more prosperous and more healthy. And on the domestic side, only on the domestic side, he was successful. On foreign policy, that's the Vietnam War, which we will talk about next week, unfortunately. Not successful. Not a good foreign policy president. Not the oversimplification of things. But he understood the legislation that could change people's lives on the domestic side, and it really did. Not just for people of color, but for college students, for people who had struggled and were poor, for all sorts of underprivileged people. The Great Society made a big difference. And so it took a person who was, in some ways kind of awful, to do some truly great things. And it's a contradiction, but he was a contradiction. Just to finish his story, and again, I'll talk about Vietnam next week. A year after Kennedy's assassination, Johnson was elected in a gigantic landslide because he had done so much so quickly. He just crushed his opponent in the 1964 election. But his term that came afterward was not as, again, successful on the domestic front, but would come to be dominated by Vietnam. And so in March of 1968, Johnson announced, he shocked everybody by saying he wasn't going to run for re-election. And he did not. And in January of '69, he went back to his ranch in Texas and lived a very short, unhappy life. He resumed smoking, which you're not supposed to do after a heart attack. He was, I don't want to say he had a death wish, but he knew his life was on the downside. And it's kind of there's a book about him that written by one of his former aides, and it's called The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson. And now that I think about it, I should call this simple summary that. That's what Johnson's story is. It's both triumph and tragedy. Okay, write up a summary of this as best you can, answer the questions, and that's all. Bye-bye.